Welcome back to Amba Podcast and Videocast. This is your host, Solomon Kibriye. In the last episode, part 1 of 3 on the Battle of Adwa, we discussed the lead-up to the First Italo-Ethiopian War, the reasons and background behind the conflict, and how it developed. Today, we will discuss the war itself and the momentous battles that would prove fateful for Ethiopia, Africa, and European colonialism. So here is Adwa Part 2, the war. So as we discussed in the last episode, Colonel Federico Piano had arrived at the Menelik Palace in 1894 to present his credentials as Italian chief representative, replacing the departing Dr. Traversi. Emperor Menelik had coldly suggested that he leave the next day with Dr. Traversi. From that moment on, it was clear that only a military solution to the dispute remained on the table. The Treaty of Wuchale had died. Emperor Menelik II had been busy putting his house in order. The debt to Italy had been paid in full. The armaments purchased from Italy and other sources had been delivered, and Menelik II had consolidated his rule by receiving the submission of Ras Mangasha Yohannes and Ras Alula Ngada. The Italians were also busy laying the groundwork to achieve their aims. Their efforts to isolate Ethiopia in the world of European diplomacy had limited success, as France and Russia were eager to thwart their efforts. Italy's allies, Austria and Germany, stood with them, and while Britain did not suspend relations completely, its foreign policy favored Italy as part of its effort to lure Italy away from its pro-German alliance. Italy was also attempting to employ divide-and-conquer tactics in Ethiopia to prepare the ground for war. Tekles Adikmokria, in his Amharic book Emperor Menelik and Ethiopian Unity, gives an account of the correspondence between Prime Minister Francesco Crispi and the new Italian governor of Eritrea, Oreste Baratieri. Crispi writes that the unforgivable position taken by Menelik requires us to make defensive plans. Just as we supported Menelik against Yohannes, we must now encourage his rivals against him. In his letters, Crispi encourages Baratieri to exploit the rivalry between Tigray and Shoa to fracture and weaken the Ethiopian side. In particular, Crispi writes, Mangasha and Tigray and Mekonnen and Harar, aside from personal ambitions, will undoubtedly have personal grudges and hatred towards Menelik. When Menelik dies, the empire can become two states under the protection of Italy, one in the north and one in the south. There might be other routes or solutions that would serve our interests, and it will be difficult, but it is possible. I have faith that Your Excellency will find and propose to us the appropriate representatives with proven intelligence whom we can send to Mangasha and Mekonnen. Foreign Minister Baron Alberto Blanc wrote Baratieri an even more blatant letter. He stated, everything we are doing in the north with Ras Mangasha and the south with Ras Mekonnen is to magnify our superiority. By dividing them, we can assert Italian protection over these two regions over time. The Cabinet of Ministers has authorized you to provide Lieutenant Mulazini with all the needs to further this effort with Ras Mangasha. It has also authorized the gathering of preliminary intelligence in regard to this effort with Ras Mekonnen by Cavaliere Pietro Felter. Baron Blanc did express his view that turning Ras Mekonnen might be a bit more difficult. Both Crispi and Blanc, in their belief that they could drive a wedge in Ethiopian ranks, were very misguided. While they were not wrong that Ras Mangasha nursed ambitions and held resentments and grudges against Menelik II and Shoan ascendants, they deeply underestimated his patriotism. As for Ras Mekonnen, they clearly had no idea of the very deep ties of loyalty and personal affection that tied him to his cousin, Emperor Menelik II. This points to another early victory of Menelik in the area of counterintelligence. Menelik had long been feeding false intelligence to Italian spies like Felter and Mulazzini about internal divisions, personal grudges and feuds, public discontent, and nobles preparing rebellions, making the Italians believe the empire was on the verge of collapse and that they held a political upper hand. A little more about General Oreste Baratieri, a key figure in the coming war. Oreste Baratieri was born on November 13, 1841, in Condino, in what was then the princely county of Tyrol in the Austrian Empire, but later became the county of Trentino in the Kingdom of Italy. His family name was originally Barater, before they Italianized it to Baratieri. Baratieri began his career as a volunteer for Giuseppe Garibaldi's Red Shirts fighting for Italian unity. Following the unification of Italy, Baratieri pursued a military career, joining the regular Italian army and fighting at the Battle of Custoza on 24 June 1866 against the Austrian forces in Venetia. While the Italians lost that particular battle, Baratieri distinguished himself and was noticed for it. Rising to the rank of general by 1891, Baratieri was appointed commander of Italian forces in colonial Africa and in 1892 became governor of Eritrea. In Eritrea, Baratieri won several victories over the Mahdists in the Sudan, particularly at the Battle of Kassala on 17 July 1894, and had earned a reputation for military competence. His placement as governor of Eritrea was precisely to prepare for the coming military confrontation with Ethiopia. 1894 was an eventful year. In June, Ras Mangasha Yohannes departed from Addis Ababa to return to Tigray. Ras Mangasha returned to Tigray without Ras Alula. Ras Alula had entered into disagreements with Ras Mangasha and had become somewhat disillusioned with the prince he had so fiercely championed. Ras Alula remained behind with Emperor Menelik giving counsel on the situation with Italy, something that did not please Italian authorities who regarded him with deep hostility ever since the Battle of Dogali in the previous reign. Teclis Adik Mokrea writes that there is little doubt that the inevitability of war with Italy had been a major topic of discussion between Ras Mangasha Yohannes and the emperor before his return to Tigray. Soon after Ras Mangasha arrived at his seat in Mekele, he received a visit from Lieutenant Mulazzini, who was serving as Italian resident representative at Adwa. Mulazzini, acting on his instructions from Baratieri, began his work of trying to instigate trouble between Ras Mangasha and the emperor. Ras Mangasha received him with his customary warmth and appeared to be receptive to his efforts. Little did Mulazzini know, not only was Ras Mangasha not receptive, but he was busy secretly corresponding with Dejazmach Bata Hagos, the lord of the district of Akala Guzai inside Eritrea, encouraging him to rebel against the colonizers. This would lead to the first actual armed conflict of the war. Before we get to that, a little on the background of Dejazmach Bata Hagos. Bata Hagos was born into a noble family of the district of Akala Guzai in the southern part of what is now Eritrea. He aspired to rule Akala Guzai and as a result ended up in constant conflict with the close relatives of Emperor Yohannes IV. Emperor Yohannes' maternal uncle was Ras Arya Dimsu. He was also known as Ras Arya the Elder, Ras Arya the Younger being the emperor's only legitimate son, Ras Arya Selassie Yohannes. Ras Arya the Elder was a hugely influential figure at his nephew's court, and a man on whom Yohannes IV relied on, much as Emperor Menelik II would later rely on his uncle, Ras Darge. Both Ras Arya and Ras Darge were the older, wiser, more level-headed figures who were deeply respected by their crowned nephews and who were depended on for advice and guidance. As such, Ras Arya and his children possessed great power in the region and claimed key possessions and governorships. One area that they had their sights on was Akala Guzai, which brought them into conflict with the Jazmach Bata Hagos and his family. In his battles with Ras Arya's sons, Bata Hagos actually killed Ras Arya's son Ambai, and as a result, earned the enmity of his brother, the Jazmach Debre Hayla. He entered into further conflict with Ras Mangasha Yohannes, especially after the death of Yohannes IV, over control of Akala Guzai, and spent much time as a rebel in the locality of Habab. When the Italians took over and formed the colony of Eritrea, the Jazmach Bata was among the local nobility that accepted them and even served them by leading native military units of the Italian colonial army known as the Askaris. The Italians had courted both the Jazmach Bata Hagos and the Jazmach Debre Hayla to facilitate their control over Akala Guzai, but given the bitter hatred between the two, eventually had to choose and had chosen the Jazmach Bata. He was the ranking local native noble of Akala Guzai, and the Italians allowed him to set up his seat at the major town of Seganeti. Not long after entering the service of Italy, the Jazmach Bata Hagos and his family converted to Roman Catholicism. However, strains soon developed in the relationship. In the Italian view, the colonial authorities had treated the Jazmach Bata with great honor. As a local nobleman, he was accorded honors and dignities over the general native population of the region. But any Italian, no matter how humble born, outranked a native noble. He also began to resent the way natives were being treated by the colonial authorities. To a man of his birth, this became an increasingly bitter pill, and his views on the intrinsically racist nature of colonial rule became more and more intolerable as time went by. It is said that one day the Jazmach witnessed a local native being tied to the ground and flogged. He is reported to have declared that he wished he had died before witnessing his countrymen being humiliated thus by these foreigners. With his resentments growing more intense, and his regrets over entering Italian service deepening, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Jazmach Bata began to correspond with both Ras Mangasha Yohannes and Emperor Menelik II and began to plot a rebellion. However, the Italians learned of this correspondence through their spy network and decided that they would summon the Jazmach Bata to Asmara on false pretexts and arrest him. They would then take him under arrest to Asab, where he would be detained. The Jazmach Bata, however, learned of this plot from a fellow Eritrean Catholic working in the colonial administration. At the time, the Italian resident administrator in Seganeti was a Lieutenant Sanguinetti, who worked with an Eritrean local translator named Gavrik Ziabhir. Seeking to beat the Italians to the punch, on December 14, 1894, the Jazmach Bata Hagos, together with his brother, the Jazmach Sengel Hagos, and some of their trusted officers, came to dinner at the home of Lieutenant Sanguinetti, and while having drinks, suddenly seized the resident administrator and threw him to the ground. They bound his hands and feet, taking him captive. Angrily, the lieutenant declared, "Italy is great, so it is without doubt that God shall punish you for this." The Jazmach Bata Hagos retorted, "Ethiopia is even greater than Italy." The translator, Gavrik Ziabhir, tried in vain to get the Jazmach Bata and his men to release Sanguinetti, but to no avail. Bata Hagos tried to convince Gavrik Ziabhir to join him and his brother in the rebellion against the colonizer. But Gavrik Ziabhir refused, and instead pleaded with the Jazmach Bata to desist. As a result, Gavrik Ziabhir found himself locked up with Sanguinetti. The Jazmach Bata Hagos and his men then took full control of the town of Seganeti, imprisoned the 2 Italian telegraph workers in the town, and cut the telegraph line so that communications with the colonial authorities was cut off. The new governor, General Baratieri was visiting the town of Karen when he learned that the telegraph lines were no longer working to Seganeti on the morning of the 15th of December. Much discussion was held with his staff about whether this was just a technical difficulty or if this was a cause for concern. They soon learned, however, that the line had been deliberately cut and that Dejazmach Bata Hagos had raised a rebellion against Italian rule. Promptly, General Baratieri ordered Major Toselli to march to the town of Mehreba, not far from Saganeti, with a force of Italian and Eritrean Askari troops. Toselli repaired the telegraph line up to Mehreba and began to await reinforcements before acting against Dejazmach Bata. In the meantime, he sent messages to Bata Hagos, offering to let bygones be bygones if he would only release Sanguinetti and the other Italian prisoners. His plans, though, were to simply delay a confrontation until more troops could arrive. Bata Hagos, on his part, was not fooled, but he made a strategic blunder. Rather than send messages asking for support from Ras Mangasha and the Tigrayan lords, Dejazmach Bata instead gathered his 1,600 men and laid siege to the nearby Italian fortress at Halai. He sent an offer to the commanding officer of the fort, Captain Castellazzi, stating that if the officer relinquished the fortress and handed over all his weapons, he and all his men would be given safe passage and allowed to leave. Castellazzi sent assurances that he would be willing to surrender his weapons and the fortress if he and all his men were allowed to leave. He suggested that Bata Hagos send his representatives to negotiate terms. Dejazmach Bata sent his top officers into the fortress to negotiate. Castellazzi immediately seized these top men of Dejazmach Bata and put them in chains. The infuriated Dejazmach immediately launched a full attack on the fort, and the Italians responded. Hearing the sound of battle at a distance, Major Toselli immediately assembled all the forces he could muster and rushed to Halai and attacked Dejazmach Bata from the rear. Fighting both a frontal action against Castellazzi and a rear action against Toselli, Dejazmach Bata Hagos didn't have a chance. Teclis Adikmokrea speculates in his book that had the Dejazmach had modern communications equipment like the Italians had with their telegraph, he might have been able to summon Ras Mangasha and others to come assist him. However, Teclis Adikmokrea also states that he believed that Ras Mangasha had been given strict instructions not to enter into any direct military confrontations with the Italians, but to simply prepare for war until Menelik ordered him to. A coordinated response was seen as essential. Dejazmach Bata Hagos' rebellion had been launched too soon. No relief came for Dejazmach Bata, and after he and his men killed 11 and wounded 20 of the Italian forces, he was struck by gunfire and died on the field of battle. In an act that deeply horrified the people of the region, Major Toselli ordered that Dejazmach Bata was to be denied a Christian burial. His body was to be left exposed to the elements to be consumed by vultures and hyenas. This only added to the rage and hatred that the colonial administration was inspiring. Toselli earned the reputation of a beast among Ethiopians and Eritreans alike. In the meantime, Dejazmach Bata had ordered that Lieutenant Sanguinetti, the translator Gebrexiabir, and the 3 Italian telegraph workers be taken by his officer, Basha Tesfa Mariam, from Saganeti to Anticho and handed over to Ras Mangasha Yohannes. Basha Tesfa Mariam, with about 40 men, had taken these prisoners into Tigray and were traveling down a very treacherous and difficult route. Gebrexiabir had learned from people along the route that Dejazmach Bata had been defeated and killed at Halai, and informed Saganeti. He also tried to convince the men taking them to Ras Mangasha that it was a fool's errand and that Ras Mangasha was a friend to Italy, and that he would simply return the Italians to Asmara and make them all look like fools. Basha Tesfa Mariam seems to have had similar thoughts and asked Debre to see if Sanguinetti would swear on a cross and a Bible that he would forgive him and his men and guarantee that they would not be punished if they returned them to Sanguinetti. Lieutenant Sanguinetti was more than willing to do so, and so the prisoners were returned to Sanguinetti, and the episode of Bata Hagos's rebellion in Akala Guzai came to a close. It was only a prelude of the bloodshed to come. In the meantime, Ras Alula was not the only Tigrayan noble to have quarreled with Ras Mangasha in the aftermath of his submission to Emperor Menelik II. Ras Sibhat Aragawi, the Shum or Lord of Agami, had also quarreled with Ras Mangasha and was imprisoned by him on Amba Salama. Ras Mangasha had then appointed Dejazmach Tesfaye of Antalo as Shumagami in Ras Sibhat's place. The position of the Shumagami had long been held by the members of the House of Sabagadis, descendants of Dejazmach Sabagadis Waldu, a major warlord of the Zemena Mesafint period. So this appointment had caused much resentment among Ras Sibhat's powerful relatives. Indeed, Ras Sibhat's cousin, Dejazmach Hagos Tafari, was so outraged by this act that he took his forces and crossed over into Eritrea and took refuge with the Italians. The Italians also attempted a very ill-advised dynastic challenge to Menelik II, in which they continued their trend of misjudging senior Ethiopian figures. In 1894, 2 young Ethiopian nobles had been sent to receive a modern Western education at a Swiss boarding school in Neuchâtel. They were being educated at the emperor's expense and at the suggestion of his trusted Swiss advisor, Alfred Ilk. They were Lij Guksa Dargi and Qitao Zamaniel. Qitao Zamaniel was the son of the chief chamberlain to Empress Daitu. Lij Guksa Dargi, however, was the son of Ras Dargi Haile Selassie and thus a member of the Imperial dynasty, a first cousin to Emperor Menelik II and Ras Makonnen. His father, Ras Dargi, was a half-brother to Menelik's father, Nugus Haile Melekut, king of Shawa, and Tananyor Haile Selassie, mother of Ras Makonnen. When Theodros II had marched on Shawa in 1855 to restore the direct rule of the imperial throne, King Haile Melekut, who had been quite ill, died of his illness before he could rally his troops. It had been his brother, Dargi, that raised the banner of his little nephew Menelik and organized a resistance. He had failed, however, and had been taken captive along with Menelik by Theodros II. Theodros developed a strong affection for both Menelik and his uncle Dargi, and held Dargi in great esteem for his bravery and his judgment. When Menelik returned to Shawa as king, and later ascended the imperial throne as emperor, his uncle, who had long served as a surrogate father, became his foremost and most trusted counselor. He was a senior prince of the dynasty and a statesman who was well regarded by Menelik's friends and foes, including Emperors Teklagiorgis II and Johannes IV. Ras Dargi had 5 sons and 3 daughters, and Guksa was the second to youngest son. To the Italians, having an Ethiopian prince close at hand, just north of the border in Switzerland, was a temptation they could not resist. In January 1895, Lij Guksa Dargi was lured to the Italian border along with his friend Qitao Manuel, and were met by none other than Afwerk Gebreyesus, the young Ethiopian student who had informed Ras Makonnen about Italy's claim of a protectorate during the ratification of the Treaty of Wuchale. In spite of this earlier service to his country, Afwerk was about to begin a long career as an agent for Italian interests that would extend through the reigns of 4 Ethiopian monarchs. Afwerk, on behalf of the Italians, persuaded Lij Guksa not only to go to Rome, but to agree to enter the service of Italy. In exchange, the Italians assured him that when they conquered Ethiopia, they would enthrone Lij Guksa in the place of his cousin Emperor Menelik II. This act of betrayal by a member of the imperial house would be regarded with shock in Ethiopia, and Afor Ghebreyesus's role in it would earn him infamy. Italy also tried to foment rebellion inside Ethiopia by actively courting Muslim nobles. Captain Salvatore Persico, an Italian officer who was fluent in Arabic and well-versed in Islamic religion and customs, together with a Lieutenant Giannini, traveled through the lands of the Wajrat, Azebo, and Raya people, courting the revered religious leader Sheikh Tolha bin Jafar. They also approached the Afar leader, Sultan Muhammad Hanfari of Ausa, and Ras Mikael Ali of Wollo. Although Ras Mikael had converted to Orthodox Christianity under Emperor Johannes IV, he was the head of the Mameluch clan of Warimenu and a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and thus deeply respected by the Muslims of Wollo. The Italians believed that resentments would still be festering among the Muslims of the region, following the policy of forced conversion to Christianity that Emperor Johannes IV had employed in Wollo. They distributed large sums of money and other gifts among the notables of the region. Their efforts bore some fruit. The governor of the districts of Totosi and Rasa, Sheikh Abdul Rahman bin Yusuf, had developed a strong friendship with Persico, and had a long relationship with Count Pietro Antonelli, having been assigned to escort the Count between the coast and Addis Ababa many times over the years. Sheikh Abdurrahman happened to be the son-in-law of the Afar Sultan of Ausa, Muhammad Hanfari, and served to introduce the Italian agents to the Sultan. The Italians began to pour large amounts of weaponry and money to both Sheikh Abdul Rahman and Sultan Muhammad. Tekles Adikmokria states that the vast amounts of cash that flowed from Asmara to the Sultan of Ausa and to Sheikh Abdul Rahman far exceeded what Emperor Menelik was able to provide. This convinced both nobles that Italy was invincible and contributed to their betrayal of the emperor and their allying themselves to Italy. When Sheikh Abdul Rahman's treason became known, Emperor Menelik II stripped him of his governorate and divided them between Dejazmach Mokria Germami and Dejazmach Wolde Ashagri. As mentioned earlier, the Italians courted Sheikh Tolha bin Jafar, a man who had a strong following among the Raya and Azabo Muslims. Sheikh Tolha had first gone into rebellion against Emperor Johannes IV when that emperor had decreed that all Muslim nobles of Wollo were to convert to Christianity or lose their lands. He had fought against the emperor relentlessly in Wollo, and then going into exile with his followers to the Sudan, where he allied himself to the Mahdists. He joined the Mahdists fighting against Negus Tekle Haymanut, king of Gojam, at the Battle of Saruha, and participated in the sack of Gondar. He fought on the Mahdist side at the Battle of Metama, where Johannes IV was killed. After the death of Johannes, he had returned to Ethiopia under the religiously much more tolerant Menelik II, but continued to lead Raya and Azabo and other Muslim forces in clashes against Ras Wali Butul. He now joined forces with the Italians and participated in the war between Italy and Ethiopia on the Italian side, most significantly in the Battle of Amba Alage, which we will discuss shortly. However, unlike Sheikh Abdul Rahman bin Yusuf and Sultan Muhammad Hanfari, Sheikh Tolha was not motivated by Italian bribes and power, but long-held resentments. Yet in marked contrast, while Ras Mikael and other nobles of the region, both Muslim and Christian, continued to accept Italian gifts, they stayed firm in their loyalties to the emperor and their country. Other Italian officers also worked on dividing the Ethiopian elites. Gustavo Bianchi worked on Negus Tekle Haymanut, king of Gojam, while Major Cesare Nerazzini and the tradesman Pietro Felter worked on Ras Makonnen in Harar. In Ras Makonnen's case, the Italians tried to feed ambition by offering Italian sponsorship for Makonnen making a bid to become king of Hararge. They also used the offer, as well as veiled threats, that Italy could easily obtain permission from the British to use the port of Zela to send in a military force to either defend Harar if needed or attack it. In a letter to General Baratieri, Italian Foreign Minister Baron Blanc in February 1895 blandly states that Britain had indeed permitted the Italians to use Zela to send troops to Harar, and that Baratieri was to have Rasmussen notified that it was only the deep respect Italy had for him that they had not done so already. He was to make it known to Rasmussen that he must consider his own future and make a choice between the mortal Menelik II and the immortal power of Italy. It is clear that the Italians had very poor understanding of Ethiopians and their ties of loyalty, and no concept of their deep patriotism. Indeed, the trend of thought in Europe and North America at that time was that people in non-European societies were primitive and did not have a sense of loyalty or patriotism. It was a hubris for which they would pay dearly. They interpreted the gratitude for gifts and assurances of friendship as signs that these figures would rally to their flag. Indeed, Teclis Adikmokrea writes that General Baratieri's reports to Prime Minister Crispi and the Foreign Ministry claimed things like, "Mohammed Humphrey is completely our man. Ras Mikhail has pledged his loyalty to Italy. Nugus Tekla Haymanot has received my envoys with joy. Wakshum Burru has pledged his loyalty even more clearly than Ras Mikhail. In Harar, Rasmussen has said that when the war starts, he will come and join our forces. The Ichegi Theophilos and all the clergy of Aksum are our instruments." Of these figures mentioned at that time, only Mohammed Humphrey and Ichegi Theophilos were indeed firmly in the Italian camp, and Wakshum Burru was indeed engaged in seditious negotiations with the Italians. The rest were people that it is quite amazing that the Italians thought they could turn. These reports reassured Rome that victory was certain and that the conquest of Ethiopia would be quick and easy. They could not have been more wrong. Teclis Adikmokrea writes that as more and more opponents of Ras Mangasha took refuge in Eritrea, a military confrontation between the prince and the Italian forces assembling on the Merab River line became inevitable. Outwardly, though, General Baratieri and Ras Mangasha were still exchanging pleasantries by letter while strengthening their armies, and neither was fooled by the outwardly friendly words of the other. The Italians, on their part, were provisioning, arming, and training the forces of Dejazmach Tesfa Mariam, Dejazmach Agus Tafari, and others who had crossed over into Eritrea from Tigray for various reasons, most for clashes with Ras Mangasha. The Italians also organized other native troops from the Beni Amr, Belin, Bogos, Karen, and Habib people, as well as from recruits from the Sudan. The Italian victories against the Mahadists at Agordat and Kassala had served to increase their reputation and gave them an aura of invincibility in the region. At this point, Baratieri sent messages to the notables of Agami, assuring them that Italy would free their lord Ras Subhat from his imprisonment and return him to his rightful seat. At the same time, he sent a letter to Ras Mangasha stating that he wished to come to Adwa to meet with the Ras, hash out their problems, and renew the good relations they had once had. Then, without awaiting a response from Ras Mangasha and without permission to enter his territories, General Baratieri crossed the border and entered the town of Adwa with a force of Italian and native troops on December 31st, 1894. It was barely 2 weeks since the revolt of Dejazmach Bata Hagos and his death, where his body had been denied Christian burial by Toseli and left for wild beasts to consume. Baratieri was surprised to see that every able-bodied man had left the town ahead of his arrival, taking up arms and joining Ras Mangasha's army, which was encamped not far from the town. Only the women of Adwa, a few elderly men, and the clergy were present to welcome him. However, the Italian ally Ichegi Theophilos, along with the clergy of the town, came out in glittering procession with their best vestments, processional crosses, and gold-embroidered umbrellas to welcome the Italian governor of Eritrea. Baratieri made a show of kissing the crosses of the Orthodox priests and gave a speech to try to win over his audience, many of whom were very wary of his arrival. He dispatched a force of soldiers to march towards Aksum to free Ras Subhat Aragawi, but then learned that Ras Mangasha was moving his troops and that he was in danger of being encircled in Adwa. He was suddenly beset with doubts. His belief had been that upon his arrival in Adwa, the nobility of Tigray would flock to him to bow down and submit to the power of Italy and abandon Ras Mangasha and Menelik II, and the people would receive him joyously. Instead, he saw that the people that he passed had looked upon his arrival sullenly, that no nobles flocked to his banner, and that able-bodied men were rushing to join Ras Mangasha. Some of his troops even looted some homes in Adwa, further angering the local population. Baratieri now feared that the Mahdists might take this opportunity to attack Eritrea through Kassala again, perhaps even attack Karen while he was far away in Tigray. He decided to abandon the attempt at freeing Ras Subhat and was heading back to Eritrea when his force became completely surrounded by the army of Ras Mangasha Yohannes. Seeing that all had failed, Baratieri approached Ejege Theophilos and said he had come to make peace and not war with Ras Mangasha. But if Ras Mangasha was not prepared to talk to him, he should just let him return to Asmara. The Ejege went to Ras Mangasha's camp and scolded the Ras and his men for showing such hostility to a man who had come in peace, and urged them to let the governor of Eritrea return to Asmara. Faced with this defense by a very senior cleric of the Orthodox Church, Ras Mangasha acquiesced, and General Baratieri and his soldiers returned to Adikwala in Eritrea. However, it seems that Ras Mangasha immediately regretted doing this, as he promptly rose with his forces and crossed the Mereb River and entered Akala Guzai. General Baratieri then sent messages to all his officers, urging them to prepare for war. Major Toseli, with his Italian battalion, and Lieutenant Sanguinetti leading the native Askari troops, quickly marched forward and occupied the strategic town of Coatit. Lieutenant Mulazini, who had earlier fled from his post as consul at Adwa, now led a contingent force of native troops from Sarai and joined Toseli and Sanguinetti at Coatit. With the forces of Major Galliano taking up the left flank and Major Hidalgo guarding the rear, the Italian forces under the command of Toseli faced off with the army of Ras Mangasha Yohannes, Prince of Tigray. In the early hours of January 13, 1895, just as dawn broke, Captain Chikoyo Dikola fired a cannon into the camp of Ras Mangasha. The First Ethio-Italian War had begun. So, the first day of the war did not go well for Italy. The rough terrain made things difficult for the Italians, and the Ethiopian forces had a clear advantage. However, the Italians were able to prevent the Ethiopians from surrounding them. On the second day, however, the Ethiopians found that their supplies, especially water, were running dangerously low, and so Ras Mangasha retreated to Shimzana and then Senafe. It also seems that Ras Mangasha was given wrong information that major reinforcements had reached Toseli. The Italians took this as a victory, and word spread that Ras Mangasha Yohannes had fled to Senafe from Coatit. It was also revealed that several senior Tigrayan nobles, such as Dejazmach Tedla Aiba, his brother Dejazmach Arya Aiba together with his son Kanyazmach Tafari Arya, and Dejazmach Guzai Haile Mariam had been killed. The new Shum Agami, Tesfaye, was seriously wounded as well. This no doubt had a negative effect on the morale in Tigray, where this news was received with shock. On the Italian side, Lieutenant Sanguinetti, the administrator of Akala Guzai, who had been imprisoned by the late Dejazmach Bata Hagos, was wounded and would soon die of his injuries. In a major blunder, a very large number of the native Askari soldiers that had been taken prisoner by Ras Mangasha's army and had been taken with him managed to escape and return to Coatit, where they reported to the Italians that the Ethiopian forces were in utter disarray and that many of the soldiers were heading to Tokonda and then Senafe. Baratieri quickly ordered a council of his military staff at 3 in the morning and agreed that the Italian forces must pursue the Ethiopians immediately. All soldiers were given 4 days' provisions and sent after Ras Mangasha's army. After crossing difficult mountainous terrain, the Italians came upon a fertile plain where they saw Ras Mangasha's army had encamped. The Italians opened cannon fire on the camp, and although Ras Mangasha bravely tried to rally his troops, the Ethiopians were clearly shocked at the speed in which the Italians had followed them and attacked. To make matters worse, the Italians scored a direct hit on Ras Mangasha's royal tent and destroyed it by cannon fire, killing several of his high-ranking officers. As night fell, the Italians halted their gunfire to await sunlight the next day to aim their guns more accurately, but in the morning they found that the Ras and his forces were gone. They had clearly left in disarray, as the Italian sources would write that in Ras Mangasha's destroyed tent they found many of his personal effects, including his gold watch that Baratieri had sent him as a gift, his cologne, his prayer book, and numerous letters he had received from the late Bata Hagos, the French-born head of the Lazarus mission in Ethiopia, and Emperor Menelik II. They would see from these letters that it was Ras Mangasha who had incited Dejazmach Bata into his rebellion, and that he was encouraged by the French-led Lazarists. Baratieri decided to fortify his position and improve his advantage. He placed Major Galliano in charge of Senafe and appointed Dejazmach Hagos Tafari as Shum Agami. He then traveled to Mizua to hold a celebration of this victory before returning to Asmara to continue war preparations. Ras Mangasha, who had gone to Akala Guzai with 18,000 troops, 14,000 of whom were armed with firearms, the rest with swords and spears, had lost at least 1,000 men, among whom were several of his best officers and nobles. He also had about 2,000 wounded men. He retreated back to his seat at Mekele to prepare for further battles as well. From Mekele, Ras Mangasha sent an urgent request to the emperor to ask him to send the Imperial army forces from Shoa to thwart the invader. However, unlike the Italians in Eritrea, Ethiopia did not have a telegraph network. Therefore, news of the defeat at Senafe and Ras Mangasha's messages did not reach the capital for some days. In the meantime, Major Toselli, leading Italian forces, and Dejazmach Hagos Tafari, leading native-born Askaris, seized Adigrat and all of Agami. Major Emilio, leading another contingent of native Askaris, seized Adwa, and a force under General Arimondi marched on Mekele in pursuit of Ras Mangasha Yohannes. Everywhere their troops occupied, the Italians began to appoint officials and administrators as if the war was over. Ras Mangasha by now saw that to fight the Italians before receiving reinforcements from the emperor would simply be condemning his army to obliteration. So he abandoned Mekele, first for Antalo and then for Debre Hayla. Baratieri proudly sent telegrams to King Umberto, Prime Minister Crispi, and the foreign and war ministers, announcing what he described as a great monumental victory at Senafe and at Coatit. King Umberto congratulated General Baratieri on this victory of the civilized over the savage, and for Baratieri's brave and intelligent leadership. Prime Minister Crispi, in his letter, equated Baratieri's victory to that of Garibaldi's against superior forces. He went on to say that the land of Tigray is open to us now. If we fail to take it, it will be our own fault. It would seem that exaggeration by General Baratieri and the ill-informed jubilation of the king and his ministers, who raced to pay homage to the general for his victory, made it seem that these victories were decisive. Indeed, reports in the jubilant Italian press indicated that these were decisive battles. However, the Italians had only defeated Ras Mangasha Yohannes, the governor and prince of Tigray. They did not take into account the many other armies and commanders across Ethiopia who would shortly be on the march. These celebrations were very premature. Baratieri was elevated in rank from major general to lieutenant general. His military strategies were glorified in the press, and Italy's ally, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, even sent him a praise-filled message of congratulations. Both the German Emperor and the King of Italy decorated the general with high orders, and he was lauded across Europe as a great tactician. Prime Minister Crispi was eager to press forward with the political advantages these victories and Baratieri's new greatness could provide for his pro-colonial and expansionist policies. Therefore, he invited Baratieri to come to Rome to both celebrate his newfound greatness and to strategize about next steps. In the meantime, in Addis Ababa, developments were progressing rapidly. It was around this same time as Baratieri was preparing to travel to Italy that in May of 1895, engineer Luigi Capucci was arrested in Addis Ababa and charged with espionage. Capucci was a graduate of the University of Pisa who had been present in Shoa for over a decade, engaged in building and engineering projects for Emperor Menelik from Ankober Tuntoto to Addis Ababa. He had close ties to the emperor from his days as king of Shoa and had been involved in numerous projects from gold smelting, gunpowder mixing, church building, bridge construction, to the armaments and textile trades. He was very well connected among the aristocracy and trading circles and was able to gather a great deal of information, although a good portion of it was planted by the authorities to mislead the Italian intelligence network, of which they were very aware. Now, one of Capucci's couriers had defected and revealed the secret ciphered communications that Capucci had been sending to the Italian authorities in Eritrea regularly. The emperor had long been aware of these communications and had broken the cipher, but had waited until now to strike as part of what Chris Prouty in her book Empress Taitu and Menelik II, Ethiopia 1883 to 1910, calls a calculated move to tighten security. Upon Capucci's arrest, the emperor ordered Rasmussen to expel Pietro Felter from Harar. In accordance with Ethiopia's treaties with European powers at the time, Europeans arrested in Ethiopia were to be judged by fellow Europeans, and so a jury of 2 Armenians, 1 Greek, and 5 Frenchmen was assembled. Among these men was Mondon Videye, who declared at the outset of the trial that in France spies were shot. This did not sit well among some of the other Europeans who thought this violated European racial solidarity, and he would be heavily criticized over this statement in Europe. Capucci was indeed sentenced to death, but the emperor commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. He was incarcerated in the citadel of Ala Yuamba in northern Shoa and would remain there for the duration of hostilities until he was released with a peace treaty after the war was over. In the meantime, Baratieri arrived in Italy in July of 1895 and received a hero's welcome. The streets were packed with wildly cheering crowds. He was received an audience by King Umberto and Queen Margherita, as well as Prime Minister Crispi, before proceeding to Parliament. There he was received rapturously by cheering parliamentarians crying out his name. Baratieri traveled around the main cities of Italy for 50 days, receiving similarly rapturous welcomes, and was addressed numerous times with speeches extolling his greatness and heaping him with honors. Teclis Adikmokrea writes that this may well have built up Baratieri's self-image and sense of invincibility to his own detriment. Prime Minister Crispi and King Umberto led the pro-colonial political alliance in what can only be described as a marriage of convenience. Crispi was much criticized by those on the left and on the right as being authoritarian in spite of many political reforms that he had championed. He was a Freemason, which did not endear him to the Roman Catholic hierarchy, which at any rate had cold relations with the Italian monarchy after the conquest of the Papal States. On top of that, Crispi had been embroiled in a bigamy scandal. He was charged with marrying a woman while another woman he had married earlier and had never divorced was still alive. He got out of this by saying that his previous marriage was not legal because he had married that woman while yet another woman, his first wife, was still alive. Thus, he argued that that second marriage was never legal, and now that his first wife was dead, this third marriage was not bigamous. He was involved as well in a financial scandal with the bankruptcy of the Banco di Roma, which he had used to bring down his rival Giovanni Giolitti, and had discredited many politicians and society figures, but in which he himself was implicated. However, his actions to protect the reputation of King Umberto I in this scandal caused the king to reciprocate and push for his return to the prime ministership, as well as to keep him in office. King Umberto is said to have said of Crispi, "He is a pig, but a necessary pig." The fact that they also shared a vision for Italian colonial expansion served to unite them, even though they were not otherwise compatible people. The king and the prime minister protected each other's political interests. Now, with Baratieri's tour of triumph, even the traditionally anti-colonial leftist groups applauded enthusiastically when Foreign Minister Blanc threatened Emperor Menelik, whom he termed a rebel. He declared that if the emperor dared to attack the Italian possessions of Tigray and Agami, Italy would administer even harsher punishment than what she had already. Baratieri was able to convince the government to fund the rapid expansion of the military and administrative structures in the colony, raising expenditures from 9 million to 14 million lire. He was given assurances of further expanded funding as the territory of the colony had expanded with his victories and was expected to expand even further. In one of his speeches given before leaving Italy to return to Eritrea, Baratieri promised to thunderous applause that he would bring Emperor Menelik II to Rome in a cage. During this time, Emperor Menelik II was alarmed to hear that Wakshum Buru, the lord of Wag and Lasta, had marched north and taken possession of lands over which he and Ras Mangasha had long quarreled. Wakshum Buru was the brother of the late Emperor Teklagioris II, and thus bore a grudge against Emperor Johannes IV and his heirs. The dispute between Ras Mangasha and the Wakshum was more than just about land. With the Italians advancing and seizing large swaths of land from the retreating Ras Mangasha, Menelik was not pleased that Wakshum Buru was taking advantage and pursuing his own claims while the country was under attack. He wrote the Wakshum stating that even fighting dogs will drop their fight and unite against an attacking enemy. He advised him to make peace with Ras Mangasha. The emperor told the Wakshum he would send the wise Ato, later Kanyazmach Bayena Yimer, to conciliate him with Ras Mangasha. However, the emperor was already aware that the Wakshum was in correspondence with the Italians. Why Wakshum Buru resented Ras Mangasha is apparent, but why he would act against the emperor and the interests of his country are not. When he had traveled to Addis Ababa just months earlier, he had received a grand reception as the heir of the old Zagwe dynasty. He had entered the palace to the sound of his own Nagarit drums booming as if he were a sovereign, as required in the dynastic agreement of 1270 when the Zagwe dynasty had relinquished the imperial throne in favor of restoring the Solomonic dynasty. In the banquet that followed, while the Rasas were all honored with washing their hands with silver ewers and basins, Wakshum Buru had been granted the use of a gold ewer and basin. However, in the complicated world of Ethiopian court protocol, he may have resented the greater deference shown at Menelik's court towards Ras Mangasha. The elderly Wakshum was the heir of the ancient Zagwes, yes, and he had received great honors as was his due. But the young Ras Mangasha was the son of a crowned and anointed emperor, and was treated as such by the emperor and everyone else, and that must have stung the Wakshum. Ras Mangasha marrying the empress's niece probably didn't help either. However, what role these petty resentments played in the Wakshum's actions is not very clear. What is clear is that Wakshum Buru now sent a trusted messenger to inform General Arimondi that Emperor Menelik did not intend on marching north to face the Italians. He said this was not only because Sultan Muhammad Hanfari and the Raya and Azabu were in revolt, but that Sultan Abba Jafar of Jimma had also rebelled against the emperor, and that the king of Gojam, Nugus Tekle Hamanot, was pro-Italy and was not willing to join the effort against them. Therefore, the emperor was choosing to send Ras Mikhail of Vodno, Ras Mangasha Atikam of Damot and Agomedad, and Ras Alula Ingida with their armies to join Ras Mangasha Yohannes and Ras Wali Batul against Italy, while he himself would try to face these other threats. The Wakshum also told the Italians that Menelik was disappointed that the mission to Russia had returned with beautiful gifts but no heavy cannons as promised by Nikolai Leontiev. General Arimondi promptly reported this to Rome, where it was received with glee. Of course, Sultan Abba Jafar was not in rebellion and remained a firm friend to Menelik, and Nugus Tekle Hamanot was devoted to the emperor and was a patriot to his core. The Italians had been active spreading rumors of rebellion and now apparently became victim of their own misinformation campaign, as this report was entirely believed. The part about the Russians having not provided the heavy weapons that had been hoped for, though, was true enough. Wakshum Burub's communications with the Italians became known, and he was unceremoniously removed as Wakshum by the emperor, who replaced him with his son, Wakshum Gwangul. On September 17, 1895, the great Nagarit drum was beaten at the gates of the palace in Addis Ababa, and war was declared by the Emperor of Ethiopia. Before the assembled masses of people summoned by the booming drums, the imperial heralds read out the decree issued by Menelik II. Ketet Sarawit Meta Nagarit, they proclaimed, which translates to, assemble the army and beat the war drum. This was the traditional opening of a declaration of war in Ethiopia. In the emperor's name, the heralds went on to read the following speech. God in his graciousness has struck down my enemies and enlarged my empire and preserved me to this day. I have reigned by the grace of God. As we must all die one day, I will not be afflicted if I perish. But now, enemies have come who would ruin our country and change our religion. They have passed beyond the sea that God gave us as our border. I, being aware that the cattle were decimated and the people were exhausted, did not wish to do anything until now. These enemies have advanced, burrowing into the country like moles. With God's help, I will get rid of them. Men of my country, up to now, I believe I have never wronged you, and you have never caused me pain. Now, you who are strong, help me with your arms, and you who are weak, help me with your prayers, while you think of your children, your wife, and your faith. If you refuse my call, I warn you that you will hate me, for I will not fail to punish you. I swear by the Virgin Mary that I will never accept a plea of mercy in this. Men of Shoa, await me at Wadi Ilu by the middle of Digamt. The middle of Digamt is roughly late October on the Gregorian calendar. With this proclamation, something remarkable happened that the Italians had never predicted. From one end of the empire to the other, the people responded to the call to defend God, king, and country. It was not just the nobles of Menelik's circle and the loyal subjects that responded to his call, but even bandits and rebels who dropped all their various grievances and grudges and turned to march north to defend their country against a foreign invader. According to Chris Prouty's book, across the land, men began to report to their local officials for duty, and the churches were packed with weeping women. The reports of this anguish were so widely spread that Dr. Nerazzini at Zela reported to Rome the false rumor that Emperor Menelik II had been struck by lightning and was either dead or paralyzed. After his triumphant victory tour in Italy was completed and news arrived that Menelik II had ordered a general mobilization, Baratieri quickly returned to Asmara in late September 1895, much fortified by his experience in Italy and perhaps with an inflated sense of his achievements and abilities. He broadly underestimated the foe that he was about to face. He did not seem to be overly concerned that Menelik II had already ordered a general mobilization. His first act, upon his return, was to meet with his deputy, General Arimondi, and other top officers to decide on their strategy. He was informed that Ras Mangasha was encamped just south of Antalo and was rebuilding his forces and expecting fresh troops from the emperor in Shoa. Baratieri notified Rome of these developments and then moved his seat from Asmara and Hamasin to Adigrat in Agami, both to spread Italian rule further south and to hold strategic territories closer to Ras Mangasha from which he could attack him and then spread further into all of Tigray and Wallo. According to Tuglas Adikmokrea, Baratieri had command of approximately 116 officers, 672 Italian troops, 8,065 fully trained native Askari troops, and many hundreds of irregular native-born soldiers commanded mostly by local nobles. Ras Mangasha had set his camp at Debre Hayla in the highlands not far from Antalo, and had managed to reorganize his forces with between 4,000 and 5,000 of his own troops, alongside about 1,000 troops sent from Shoa by the emperor, and between 2,000 to 3,000 civilian men called to arms via traditional feudal levies or call-ups. Ras Mangasha had requested and was waiting for reinforcements from Ras Wali in Yeju and the newly appointed Wakshum Gwangul in Wag and Lasta. The prince was being most closely advised by Shumagami Tesfaye, who had been driven out of Agami by the Italians and replaced there by Hagos Tafari. The hereditary Shumagami, Ras Subhat Aragawi, remained imprisoned by Ras Mangasha, who had moved him from Amba Salama to Amba Alage. Tekles Adikmokre notes that the Italians had previously been able to free Dejazmach Tedla Abba Guben, who had also been imprisoned by Ras Mangasha, and had appointed him to a senior position under Major Toseli. However, Dejazmach Tedla became deeply disillusioned and escaped from Italian control and had rejoined the Ethiopian side and was now lined up at the side of Ras Mangasha, who forgave him for past transgressions. So a combination of Emperor Menelik II's declaration of war and Ras Mangasha's personal appeals was seeing some success in getting Tigrayan and Eritrean nobles who had defected to the Italian side to return to the Ethiopian camp by appealing to their patriotism. In addition to Mangasha's Tigrayan nobles, at his side were Qenyazmach Haile Mariam, Grazmach Haile Mariam, Qenyazmach Andargacho, and Fitarari Nugusi, who had arrived from the emperor in Shoa, bringing weapons and a considerable amount of money to shore up Ras Mangasha while the emperor was preparing to mobilize. Learning that these Shoa nobles and fresh troops had arrived at Ras Mangasha's camp, General Baratieri decided to strike quickly. 3 Italian columns marched out of Adigrat to confront Ras Mangasha at Debre Hayla. The first column, under the command of Major Toseli on the right, marched by way of Atsibi, while Major Galiano commanded the central and main force and marched via Agula'a and Yilo to Chalekot and Antalo. Major Emilio and his Askari native troops advanced via Hausin. Major Emilio reached the environs of Debre Hayla first on October 9, 1895. The Italians had intended on surprising Ras Mangasha and annihilating his force at Debre Hayla. However, it appears that the Ethiopian guides that the Italians had employed to lead them to Debre Hayla had somehow sent warning to the Ethiopian commanders who met in military council. They decided that fighting the Italians in full force at that point would not be wise. The decision was made that a small force would confront the closest Italian contingent, Major Emilio's native Askari force, which had been observed burning villages near Debre Hayla. The council insisted that a reluctant Ras Mangasha should retreat immediately out of Tigray with his entire force to Ras Wali's domain of Yeju and await the emperor there. They believed that the Italians killing or capturing the son of Johannes IV would be too big a propaganda blow to allow. Reluctantly, Ras Mangasha turned and left Tigray and settled his forces at Salawa. Kanyasmach Haile Mariam confronted Emilio's Askari troops, and although the Ethiopian force fought valiantly, they were both outgunned and outnumbered by the Italian force and were defeated. The Italians reported 11 dead and 30 wounded and stated that the Ethiopian forces lost 30 men and had 100 wounded casualties. They noted that all the dead soldiers on the Italian side were native Askari troops. Among the captives taken by the Italians was the wounded commander Kanyasmach Haile Mariam, who was treated for his wounds and moved to Asmara, where he was questioned closely about preparations for war in Shoa. He disdainfully informed the Italians that they had seen nothing yet. In the meantime, the Italian forces advanced rapidly from Debre Hayla and captured Amba Alage and Lake Ashenge and quickly began to appoint new governors for the various districts. Upon capturing Amba Alage, the Italians had freed Ras Subhataragawi, who agreed to help them fight his nemesis, Ras Mangasha Yohannes. According to Prouty, he was put in command of his 300 troops under Major Toseli, who commanded his own 1,850 men, and together further fortified the fortress at Amba Alage. Tekles Adik Mokrea states that disagreements rose between General Baratieri and his deputy, General Arimondi, over the next steps. General Baratieri was concerned about overextending his communications and supply lines to the front from Mizua, Asmara, and Adigrat, the main centers of Italian power, and wanted to consolidate the Italian position in the newly acquired territories. He was backed by Lieutenant Bassi, who wrote, "I do not believe this can be interpreted as a great success, as this gives us a wider territory disproportionate with our resources." This was further supported by Major Gamera, who wrote, "We pushed on to Amba Alage step by step like reckless children who stir up a wasp's nest, provoking the just resentment of the Ethiopians." On the other hand, General Arimondi wanted to press the advance southward, seizing more territory and confront the Emperor's forces while Italian spirits were still high after their recent string of victories. However, the political authorities in Rome sided with Baratieri's policy of quickly building up fortifications at Amba Alage, Debre Hayla, Antalo, Idaghamus, Mekele, and Adigrat, placing military headquarters at Adigrat and fomenting rebellion against Emperor Menelik in Lasta, Ausa, and among the Azawo and Raya people. It was at this point, according to Baratieri in his memoirs that he wrote after the war, that the Italians brought Lij Guksa Dargi from Mizua into Tigray and set him up at Idaghamus. He was, after all, their candidate to replace Menelik II as Emperor of Ethiopia. With him was Afwerk Haile Jesus as his secretary and spokesman. Baratieri would state that although Afwerk was eager to tell all who would listen in the Italian camp how much both he and the young prince loved Italy, the quiet and shy Guksa himself seemed to be quite reluctant to name anyone in Ethiopia who would champion his bid for the throne, and indeed seemed to avoid meeting any Ethiopians, even those serving Italy at that point. Baratieri described him as timid and very unsuited for military affairs in any way. His status as a member of the Imperial dynasty in the Italian camp, far from attracting recruits from the Ethiopian side, seemed to instead only increase contempt for both Lij Guksa and the Italians who had brought him. As for Guksa's father, Ras Dargi, his attitude could not have been more clear. Dr. Nerazzini, hoping the senior prince of the House of Shoa could be turned to side with Italy, had sent him a letter informing the Ras that Italy was aiming to crown his son as Emperor of Ethiopia. Ras Dargi responded in a letter that courteously began asking after Nerazzini's health, but then continued by saying, "I received your letter. I did not know you before your letter, but now I know who you really are. How damaged have I been by not knowing who you truly are all this time?" After a brief sarcastic passage stating there were no problems to be had in placing Lij Guksa on the throne, as his father was holding it in Addis Ababa as regent, Ras Dargi eviscerated Nerazzini as a liar and a doctor of lies. Ras Dargi disowned his son as a traitor, and Guzai became a pariah. Eventually, Lij Guzai slunk away from Idaghamus to Adigrat and eventually back to Mizrawa. Just before the trial of Capucci had commenced the previous May, Emperor Menelik had sent a large force of 12,000 men under the command of Ras Alula to Yejju to join with Ras Weli Betul. However, Ras Weli and Ras Alula had locked horns over strategy, and Weli was not willing to cede a district from his Yejju domain to Alula's control for him to quarter his army. Menelik, unwilling to upset his brother-in-law, then ordered Ras Alula to go to Segota in Wag instead. Now, Menelik reduced Alula's force to just 2,000 men, sending the other 10,000 of his troops to Ras Mangasha Yohannes to replenish his forces, something that can't have been pleasing to Ras Alula, but perhaps was strategically the wise thing to do. Menelik had established a large weapons depot at Werelu and several granaries for his forces at several points leading from Shoa through Wello to the north. Preparations had continued through the rainy season, with both Italian and Ethiopian forces kept from making any big moves due to the heavy rains that normally drenched the land from June to August. So by the time the mobilization decree in September had been issued, Menelik was ready to march north. Emperor Menelik II marched out of Addis Ababa at the head of his army headed for Werreilu on October 11, 1895. Also marching out on that day, at the head of her own forces, was Empress Taitu Betul. They left behind the emperor's uncle, Ras Dargi Haile Selassie, in charge as Prince Regent in the emperor's absence, and to keep an eye on the southern regions in case anyone should try to take advantage of the situation and raise a rebellion. Ras Dargi, father of Lij Guzai Dargi, who was being promoted and used by the Italians as their future puppet emperor, had angrily disowned his son. The emperor had left Azaj Guzau in charge of the capital itself. While Ras Mokonnen of Hadad had marched north towards Yejju ahead of the emperor's forces to join Ras Mangasha and Ras Weli, his brother, the Jazmaj Haile Mariam, had been left to guard the caravan routes between Djibouti and Hadad to ensure that weapons would continue to be delivered via the French port and to guard against an incursion by the Italians via the British-held port at Zela, something that the Italians had indeed planned but would fail to carry out. On November 9, 1895, while General Baratieri was reporting to Rome that the internal and external situation in Italian-held territories was tranquil, Emperor Menelik II was at Werreilu with an army numbering over 100,000 soldiers. Chris Prouty states that one of the reporters covering Baratieri wrote that Italian intelligence services were so appalling that the general had no idea how many cannons, guns, or lances the Emperor of Ethiopia commanded. For the Italian commander to say his situation was tranquil was the ultimate in ill-informed arrogance. Menelik II was marching north, not just with a massive army, but with a huge number of camp followers. These included a vast number of palace servants and attendants who carried everything from tents, clothing, and food provisions for the imperial family, clergy with their own tents that would be used as Orthodox churches, complete with tabots and all required items for carrying out the Holy Liturgy. There were women under the forces of Empress Taitu responsible for food and drink and to nurse the sick and the wounded in the event of battle. Each section of Menelik's vast army had its own special corps of people to carry their tents and to erect them quickly every time the emperor gave the signal to stop and make camp along their march north. These men were all as well armed as the regular soldiers. Upon the signal from the emperor, the first tent to go up was his own great war tent known as Desta, which was made of imperial red velvet. Once the emperor's tent went up, every other unit and group would know exactly where to pitch their tent, as each had an exact spot allocated in relation to where the emperor's tent was pitched. Chris Prouty writes that next to the emperor's tent was a large reception canopy that served the same purpose of his great Adarash, or great hall, in his palace, to hold banquets, pass judgments, and war councils. It was carpeted with Turkish and Persian rugs and contained a portable throne. The Empress's tent was lined with green silk. There was a great church tent and then 5 housekeeping tents for the making and sorting of food and drink for the imperial household. There were more tents for the royal horses and mules as well as their fodder. All in all, there were about 20 tents in this royal enclosure, which was surrounded by a cloth fence with guarded entrances on 4 sides. Outside of this royal camp, there was a large tent city that was erected every day at their new campsite and would go up completely in just an hour after the emperor gave the signal to camp. It was a testament to how organized this vast army was. It took this army city camp 18 days to get from Addis Ababa to Wadi Elu, which, although is only 150 kilometers north of the capital, did require crossing some very challenging highland terrain in an age where there were no modern roads or bridges to cross towering mountains and deep valleys and rivers. Other regional nobles leading their forces joined the emperor along the way, and his force grew from the 50,000 that left Addis Ababa to 100,000 by November 9 to well over 150,000 by the time the emperor was ready to move north from Wadi Elu. On October 25, Emperor Menelik authorized Ras Mokonnen to offer peace talks to the Italians via Pietro Felter, whom he had earlier expelled from Harar and had gone to Zela. It took Ras Mokonnen's messenger 3 weeks to reach Zela, where he found that Felter had left for Eritrea and had instead given the message to the Italian consul there, Dr. Nerazzini. Nerazzini had rather negligently decided to send the message on to Baratieri not by telegraph as he should have, but by sailboat. By the time Baratieri received the offer of talks, the advanced troops under Ras Mokonnen, Ras Mengesha, and Ras Wele were within sight of the Italian fortress on Amba Alage. Not knowing that Baratieri had only just received his offer for peace talks and deeply offended at the lack of any response, Ras Mokonnen sent another offer to Baratieri via Major Toselli on Amba Alage, who telegraphed it to the Italian commander on November 26. Baratieri asked for instructions from the government in Rome, and in the meantime, Major Toselli took it upon himself to tell Ras Mokonnen that if he really wanted peace, he would retreat to Lake Ashenge. Ras Mokonnen responded on December 2nd, saying that he was leading men who had come to make war and couldn't send back such people into retreat. Only his respect and his friendship for Baratieri had caused him to even send this second request for talks. As there was still no response from Baratieri, he would be forced to advance. Toselli, ever the hothead, responded with a supremely arrogant message that stated, "Your advance contradicts your offer to make peace. To advance means war." He continued that the fate of 2 emperors of Ethiopia had been determined at Mekele and Saati, and that although Italy had been pleased to assist a 3rd emperor onto the throne of Solomon, it could now destroy its own work and determine the fate of the same 3rd emperor, meaning Menelik II. Although word soon arrived from Baratieri to arrange a meeting with Ras Mokonnen, it was now too late, thanks to Toselli's hot-headedness. The Ethiopian side had had enough of the insolence from the Italian side. Chris Prouty writes that Major Toselli, standing on the heights of Amba Alage on the night of December 6th, could see in the middle distance the immense enemy camp as a magic spectacle of illumination fires along the horizon in order 3 great columns to the right and on the left, other fires of dispersed groups. Toselli broke into song, singing the Ave Maria sonorously into the dark night. He was confident of his position on the towering mountaintop and sure that he would be relieved with reinforcements after the first assault. He seems to have been unconcerned that the massive force he saw in camp that night was just the advanced force of Ras Mengesha, Ras Mokonnen, and Ras Wele, and that an even more immense army, led by the emperor, was not far behind. On the following morning, December 7, 1895, Ras Mokonnen, Ras Mengesha, and Ras Wele sent out a column under the command of Fitaurari Gabeyo to mark out a flanking movement around Amba Alage. They had decided that the small fortress perched atop the precipice was not worth attacking. They planned to pass it by. The force of 1,200 men had left camp at 6 a.m., and just an hour later, they ran into an Italian lookout post and exchanged gunfire. The small Italian force abandoned their post and began to retreat up the escarpment towards the fortress while exchanging gunfire. Rather than continue with marking the route for the larger army around Amba Alage and allowing the Italians to retreat into their fort, Fitaurari Gavello decided he would pursue them up the escarpment, and the gunfire grew heavier. No command had been given to fight, so there was surprise in the Ethiopian camp to hear gunfire. Hearing guns, Ethiopian soldiers began to pick up their weapons and rush to support their comrades with no organization and without their commanders. Ras Mangasha's chief aide, Tesfaye Antalo, desperately cried out, pleading to the men to desist, that Amba Alage was not strategic enough an asset to waste lives and effort on to wrest from Toselli, and that the Italians could massacre them without firing guns by just raining rocks down from their clifftop position. But the rush to join the battle overwhelmed him, and it became apparent to the Rases and the other leaders that they must join the battle and try to at least re-establish order to the assault. The Rases were displeased that they were now forced to engage in battle with the main force of the army 300 kilometers away. The Ethiopian forces began a ferocious attack on the forces on Amba Alage. Major Toselli was awoken by the gunfire. He quickly sent a message to General Arimondi, who was only 25 kilometers away, to come with reinforcements. Arimondi asked Baratieri what he should do, and Baratieri ordered him to remain where he was. Instead, he instructed him to order Toselli to hold the fortress for as long as he could, and then fall back very slowly to slow down the Ethiopian advance as much as possible. However, for some reason, Arimondi never forwarded these instructions to Toselli. The Ethiopian army sustained terrible losses trying to clamber up the sheer sides of Amba Alage to reach the fort. About 500 died on the Ethiopian side, but they were able to overwhelm the fortress. Toselli tried to retreat north towards Beit HaMariam, but could not get away from the pursuing Ethiopians. Of the close to 2,000 Italian and Askari forces that had fought to hold onto the fort, only 400 wounded and exhausted men were able to make it to Arimondi's position. Ras Subhat Haragari was able to escape capture and fled. Major Toselli lay dead on the field of battle. Ethiopia had not only defeated Italy at Amba Alage, she had annihilated close to a quarter of the Italian military forces present in Tigray at that time. The aftermath of the Battle of Amba Alage was significant on all sides. The Ethiopian forces were jubilant, and Fitaurari Gavello was the hero of the hour. He was rousingly cheered by Ethiopian forces wherever he went. The soldiers cheered him as Gobezayo instead of Gavello, translating to "I have seen a brave man." Although victorious, the three commanding Rases were furious that Fitaurari Gavello had started the battle without orders and cost them 500 valuable men, not to mention spent a great deal of effort they believed could have been better spent on targets like Mekele. All three sent angry complaints about Gavello's insubordination to the emperor. Emperor Menelik II, however, was gleeful at this victory. Although he agreed that Fitaurari Gavello deserved to be punished for causing a breakdown in military discipline and fighting without orders, it didn't stop him from proudly boasting about his brave boy Gavello, who had been born in Angolela just as Menelik had been. He ordered Gavello chained for 3 weeks as punishment for his insubordination and restricted to the emperor's immediate household. But the chains were very loose and almost ornamental, and Menelik continued to chuckle and brag about his brave Gavello, and visibly showed him every sign of favor. The victory at Amba Alage did much to quell any thought of rebellion on the part of certain Ethiopians, who were on the fence about joining Italy for whatever grievance they held. In particular, Sheikh Tolha bin Jafar, who had been with Toselli and Ras Subhat at Amba Alage, had fled, squashing any hope the Italians had of causing an uprising among the Muslims of Wollo. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the brothers of Dejazmach Hagos approached Emperor Menelik and demanded that Major Pietro Toselli be denied Christian burial. They tearfully recounted how a year earlier, Major Toselli had forbidden the body of Dejazmach Hagos from being buried and had left it exposed in the open to be eaten by hyenas and vultures. They demanded that his body now receive the same treatment. Emperor Menelik heard them out and said to them, "Do not let the savage barbarism of these Italians push you off your Christian principles. Show them who is truly civilized and Christian." He then ordered that Toselli receive a proper burial. 2 years later, Menelik would allow his remains to be dug up and returned for reburial in his hometown of Peveragno, Italy. In Italy, the reaction to the Battle of Amba Alage was decidedly mixed. On one side, there were panicked demands to recall all troops from Africa and end what was termed a wasteful and dangerous adventure. Prime Minister Crispi faced demands for a vote of no confidence in Parliament. Crispi, however, responded to the outcry with a blithe response that not mind the victories, so not mind the defeat. He placed all responsibility for the failures and victories on the military. He made a defiant statement accepting responsibility only for the Treaty of Guzai, which had given Italy Eritrea, and which Menelik had betrayed under the influence of foreign powers, i.e. France and Russia. He made the disingenuous argument that Menelik objected to Guzai because Italy wanted to end the slave trade, which was clearly not the cause of the dispute. However, Italy had found its great tragic hero in the person of Major Pietro Toselli, the hero on the mountaintop who fought valiantly under his flag for king and country and laid down his life for them. Even Queen Margherita would write to a friend, "This death of Toselli is so sublime that tears not of grief but of admiration spring to the eyes." King Umberto and Queen Margherita did not have much of a marriage, but they were firmly politically allied and were behind the colonialist elements. They both encouraged those who demanded an increase in the financial appropriation for the military efforts in Africa and the transportation of new troops to Mazowa immediately. Crispi won the vote of confidence, and the increase in funds and soldiers was quickly approved, thanks in no small part to the endorsement by the king and queen. On December 14th, Emperor Menelik's vast army passed through the difficult narrow passes at Alamata and headed to Lake Ashenge, from which the Italians had withdrawn. The Italians had also withdrawn from other less defensible spots such as Adwa in an effort to consolidate in more defensible positions. At Lake Ashenge, the emperor had held a huge review of his forces, which Prouty states was a way not only to celebrate the victory at Amba Alage, but to evaluate the numbers of those who had made it through the difficult crossing at Alamata, and as a show of force against the few adherents of the deposed Wakshumbaru in nearby Lasta who had set their hopes on an Italian victory. While Menelik was holding his rally at Ashenge, a separate large army under his cousin Ras Walda Gyurgis, Ras Tsamanado, and Azaj Walda Zadik had succeeded in surrounding the forces of the Sultan of Ausa, Muhammad Hanfari, neutralizing him and preventing him from cooperating with the Italians as he had planned. Just how good Menelik's intelligence network was should now have become very plain to the Italians when he sabotaged this important element of their plans against him. At the end of December, Emperor Menelik, with his army, left Lake Ashenge, choosing a different route than originally planned. He did this to avoid the massive camp of Ras Mekele of Wollo, where an epidemic had broken out among the horses and mules. On December 24th, his army was further enlarged as he was joined by Nugus Tekle Haymanot, king of Gojam, with his 5,000-man army. Chris Prouty writes that this was a blow to Baratieri, who had hoped Tekle Haymanot would stay out of the war due to his many losses to the Mahadists, his long-time grudge against Johannes IV and his Tigrayan armies which had devastated Gojam previously, and grudges Baratieri believed he had against Menelik. He underestimated Tekle Haymanot's patriotism and didn't understand the real ties of affection between the emperor and the king of Gojam, dating to the period that they had gotten to know each other when Menelik had held Tekle Haimanot prisoner after the Battle of Mbabu years before. The stage was set for a new battle, the Battle of Mekele. Mekele today is a significant city, but back in December 1895, it was little more than a small village that had served as one of the principal seats of Emperor Johannes IV, and where he had built his castle, which remains one of the attractions of the city today. On a mountain overlooking the town was the ancient church of Inda Jesus, which gave the mountain its name as well. The Italians had taken over this stone church surrounded by a massive wall, burned all the buildings around it, and fortified the church as a mountain fortress. It was under the command of a Major Giuseppe Galliano with 1,300 men, along with many women, some of whom were camp followers and others wives of soldiers. There were also about 100 of the wounded survivors of Amba Alage. The survivors of Amba Alage were able to provide information about the army they had faced, and Galliano was confident that in his well-fortified, strategically located fortress, he would be able to withstand any frontal attack by the forces of Rasas Mokonnen, Mengesha, and Weli. Besides, if he needed relief, General Arimondi was only a 3-day march away at Adigrat with his larger forces. The advanced troops under the three Rasas had pitched camp not far from Mekele around December 12th. They were determined that no unplanned high-cost military clashes would take place as had occurred at Amba Alage. Ever the diplomat, Ras Mokonnen wrote that day to Galliano saying that he regretted the shedding of Christian blood at Amba Alage and that the fighting had occurred without his command. He stated that he was now prepared to start the proposed peace talks. Rome, however, was not interested. The feeling there was that Amba Alage had to be avenged. The exchange of letters between Ras Mokonnen and Major Galliano was very polite, almost friendly. Ras Mokonnen's letters asked after Galliano's health and the health of his soldiers. He then begged the Italian officer in the name of Emperor Menelik that he and his people set free Ethiopian lands and leave, but that if they refused, he would be forced to make war. Galliano also replied very politely, but stated that regretfully his orders were to stay where he was and that he was armed with the best guns and cannons. They both signed themselves as your friend. These two men, however, were also playing a complicated chess game. While Italy was set on revenge, they thought it prudent to keep the Ethiopian camp, thinking they were interested in keeping negotiations alive, and so sent a Lieutenant Partini to Ras Mokonnen. He was allowed to sleep in a tent with Lieutenant Scala, who had been taken captive at Amba Alage. Scala and Partini stayed up all night, talking about what their estimates of the size of Ras Mokonnen's army was and what his strategy would be. Partini returned to Mekele the following evening to report that Ras Mokonnen had around 25,000 soldiers and had a great many guns, but that there were also a very large number of women and other camp followers who could slow him down and be a liability. Partini was then sent immediately to Adigrat, 192 kilometers away, to brief Arimondi of these things. The three Rasas remained camped near Mekele for a month with only an occasional skirmish, but by December 26, Ras Mokonnen had clearly run out of patience as he stated to Galliano in a letter that the Ethiopian side no longer believed the Italians were sincere about wanting peace talks. Indeed, Mokonnen had come under heavy criticism from many quarters for his persistent attempts at negotiating dating back to the earliest days of the dispute. Emperor Menelik, however, did not entertain these criticisms of his cousin, but they did persist, and clearly they had begun to irk the Ras. Chris Prouty reports that 3 days after this exchange, on December 29, Ras Mokonnen had requested the services of an Italian medical doctor to help Ras Bitwadded Mengesha Atikam of Damot and Agomeder, who had recently joined him, but who had been injured in a fall from his horse. Galliano sent Dr. Mosetti to care for the injured Ras. Dr. Mosetti had served in the Italian colony for a decade and had long been convinced that the Ethiopians and their leaders were barbaric savages. He returned to the Italian camp with that belief thoroughly shaken, as he took note of the generous hospitality he received in the Ethiopian camp and was struck by the aristocratic manners and the luxury of the carpets, camp beds, and good food to be found in the Ethiopian camp in comparison to the harsh conditions in the Inde Jesus fortress. He had the decency to feel embarrassed when his polite patient asked him, "Why are the Italians invading my country?" On January 5th, as the Ethiopian Orthodox Christmas approached, Ras Mokonnin issued something of an ultimatum to Galliano. The Ras said, "I have not come to make war on such a small fort. We are very numerous and have no fear of your guns. I advise you to remember Amba Alage and the end of Major Toselli." The Ras urged Galliano to give up the fort, and in exchange, Mokonnin offered to give him and all the people in the fortress safe passage with escort to Mutsuwa and would send their baggage after them. He also offered payment for the medicines and the services of Dr. Mosetti for Ras Mangesha Attica. Galliano, intent on further delaying things until he could receive reinforcements, sent Ras Mokonnin a familiar face to keep him negotiating. Pietro Felter, Mokonnin's longtime associate and former resident of Harar, now arrived at Ras Mokonnin's camp for talks aimed at gaining the Italians time to strengthen their numbers and their fortress. However, on the very next day, Ethiopian Christmas Eve, Emperor Minilik II, together with Nugus Takla Hamanut of Gojam and numerous other great nobles of the empire, arrived and joined their forces with those of Ras Mangesha Yohannes, Ras Mokonnin Walda Mikael, Ras Wili Betul, and Ras Bitwedded Mangesha Attica. Also joining the force that day, Chris Prouty writes, was Dejazmach Gassesa Walda Hanna, nephew of Empress Aitu and ruler of Simeon, with not just his army, but also a huge number of sheep, cows, and a great quantity of butter to provide feasting to celebrate Orthodox Christmas and end the Advent fast. This massive force could be seen from the Inde Jesus fort by the Italians as a virtual sea of tents surrounding the prominent red tent of the Emperor of Ethiopia. Galliano, however, believed he was secure in his mountaintop fortress no matter the massive numbers of the Ethiopian side. Emperor Menelik apparently had no intention initially of attacking the fort at Mekele. He and his advisors were considering bypassing the town, leaving a detachment to continue the siege, and taking the bulk of his army and heading to the main Italian force at Adigrat. However, on January 7, Orthodox Christmas Day, gunfire broke out between the Italians in the fort and the Ethiopian camp. Chris Prouty credits a runaway mule with having caused the initial gunfire from the Italian side, but Menelik II decided to return fire and to focus on taking this fort. Empress Aitu, her brother Ras Wili Betul, and Ras Mangesha Yohannes all opposed an assault on the fortress. They did not think a frontal assault on such a well-situated fort would be successful and would cause great loss of life. Nugus Takla Hamanut and Ras Mokonnin, however, were in favor of an attack on Inde Jesus. Ras Mokonnin led the initial infantry assault on Fort Inde Jesus on January 8 and was met with a rigorous defense from the Italians, who had the advantage of high ground and fortified walls. Ras Mokonnin himself was slightly wounded in the assault, and 500 of his men lay dead on the slopes of Inde Jesus by the time he called off the assault at nightfall. Inside the fortress, only 6 people died and 4 were wounded on this first day. It was at this point that Empress Aitu showed yet again what a brilliant strategist she was. She suggested to the emperor and his nobles that instead of attacking the fortress again, that Ethiopian forces control the water supply to the fortress and deprive the defenders of water. After reconnaissance showed that the ravine below the fortress was where the Italian forces were drawing water from, 900 of Empress Aitu's soldiers crept down into the spot and fortified it to protect it from any possible gunfire from the fort. In fact, there was no possible line of fire from the fort, and so these men could comfortably prevent any water from being drawn up into the fort with minimal effort. Empress Aitu ensured that they were made comfortable and the Ethiopians sat on the water supply for 2 weeks. The effect on the Italian forces was almost immediate. Major Galliano quickly imposed strict rationing of fluids of all kinds. He was not, however, greatly concerned at first, as he fully expected reinforcements to march in and relieve him. However, he recognized that there needed to be rationing of liquids. The way he allotted rations, however, caused some tension in his ranks. He decreed that every native Christian Askari soldier would receive 1/3 of a liter of water per day, plus a tot of beer, wine, or rum. Every Muslim Askari, as they did not consume alcohol, would receive half a liter of water. All Italian troops would receive a half liter of water like the Muslim Askaris, but would also receive their normal wine ration. This caused some resentment from the native troops towards the Italians. Galliano also decreed that any women who were not legally married to an Askari and any children with them were to leave the fortress immediately. Chris Prouty relates that this reduced the population of Indeyesus, yet many of those women returned late at night and were pulled up over the walls by ropes by their menfolk. Over the next days, Ras Makonnen continued to launch steady attacks on the fort. There were more Ethiopian casualties littering the mountainsides of Indeyesus. On January 13, Ras Makonnen asked the Italians for a ceasefire so that he could collect his dead soldiers from the mountainside for burial. Galliano responded saying he would only cease fire if the Ethiopian army withdrew 11 kilometers. Clearly, this was a ploy to regain control of the water supply, and Ras Makonnen refused. Galliano would soon regret this, as the bodies all around his fort on the sides of the mountain began to rot and the stench filled the fort and soon became overwhelming. The Ethiopian side halted the assaults on the fort and began to wait. Soon, the horses and the mules inside the fort began to die as they were not being given water at all. A woman messenger came from Adikrat and managed to sneak into the fort under cover of darkness. She told Major Galliano that no soldiers were on their way to relieve him, nor were there any current preparations to do so. Alarmed, Galliano entrusted her with a message to the commanding staff in Adikrat, saying that he had only 2 more rations to give up and that the fort was on the verge of surrender. In the meantime, Emperor Menelik summoned Pietro Felter, who remained in his camp, and began discussions about the Italian forces at Mekele under siege in Indeyesus. On January 17, Felter left Mekele headed for Idagamus, where Baratieri was located. He informed Baratieri that Emperor Menelik offered to allow the besieged men inside the fort at Indeyesus to retreat with all their weapons and their baggage to Adikrat. In exchange, the Italians would need to agree to start peace negotiations. Interestingly, Baratieri conveyed the proposal to Rome, but left out the request that peace negotiations begin. On the evening of January 19, a messenger arrived from General Baratieri and was allowed through the Ethiopian lines into the fort. He handed Galliano orders that read, "In the name of His Majesty King Umberto, cede the fort at Mekele to the Emperor of Abyssinia." Galliano openly wept. The next day, the Italians were permitted to draw 30 barrels of water from the ravine. During the course of the day, the Italian forces were busy destroying their ammunition, as they could take their guns with them, but not their bullets, with the exception of loaded machine guns. In a gracious gesture, Emperor Menelik II granted Major Galliano an audience, where he praised him for his gallant attempt at holding his ground, and presented him with a mule as a gift. Galliano was stunned to see that it took him 2 hours just to cross the Emperor's vast encampment to reach him. The Italians had lost many of their horses and mules during the siege, and so they needed more to transport themselves, their guns, and their baggage to Adikrat. Emperor Menelik offered to sell the mules, and when the amount of silver that the Italians had in the fort only covered the cost of half the mules they needed, Menelik even agreed to give them the additional mules with payment promised in the future. Empress Aitu and the Tigrayan lords were very unhappy with the terms of the surrender of the fort, particularly the agreement to let the Italians leave with their weapons. There was so much anger that Rasmukonen's troops were tasked with providing a protective escort for the Italian forces from other Ethiopian soldiers. The emperor took possession of Inda Jesus and handed it back to the Orthodox Church, and the Ethiopian victory at Mekele was complete. In an early version of fake news, the Italian public was treated in its press with rousing accounts of a heroic 45-day siege of Mekele, telling a tale of a small heroic group of Italian heroes beating back hordes of savage African tribesmen. In actuality, the siege had lasted only 2 weeks, and after the initial assaults was mostly a battle against dehydration for the Italian side. The countryside around Mekele had become depleted of provisions thanks to the extended stay of Menelik's vast army, and so the emperor decided to move on. He decided his entire army would accompany Galliano and the surrendered Italians to a new encampment near Adwa. He knew Baratieri would not attack him as long as the surrendered Italians were in his custody. He was also aware, through his spy network, that reinforcements were arriving from Italy at Mitsuwa on a daily basis, and that Italy's might in the Horn of Africa was growing daily. He was not aware, though, that Baratieri had not passed on his condition for the peaceful surrender of Mekele, that Italy reopened talks on the entire dispute, and fully expected that the Italians would soon send a delegation to begin these talks. Menelik had sent Baratieri a letter via Pietro Felter, which Baratieri now forwarded to Rome with a note that he considered Menelik's letter to be insolent. The part that offended Baratieri, and which similarly angered Crispi and King Umberto, was the part that read, "Giving proof of our Christian faith, we are sending with all their belongings and in good health those who were in the fort at Inda Jesus, even though they were exhausted by thirst, hard-pressed, and almost trampled under our feet." It was, of course, only the truth, but a furious response from the government instructed Baratieri not to negotiate until there was an Italian battlefield victory. In a further delaying tactic in order to build up his forces more, Baratieri sent Felter back to Menelik with a message that Major Salsa would be coming soon to discuss matters. Felter noted that when he delivered this message, the emperor was visibly angered. It had been 10 days since Menelik had allowed the Italian evacuation, and he had expected the Italians to send negotiators immediately. He recognized a delaying tactic when he saw one. Major Galliano was summoned to the emperor's tent and was told that all his people could now leave for Italian lands, but that 10 Italian officers would be held back until the arrival of Major Salsa. When Baratieri heard this, he ordered Major Salsa, who was already en route to Menelik's camp, to return. With no sign of Salsa's arrival, the anger on the Ethiopian side deepened. Empress Aitu, Raswele, and most of the Tigrayan lords felt their opposition to allowing the Italian forces to leave with their weapons had been vindicated. They were now urging harsh treatment of the 10 officers that were still being held. However, Rasmukonen and Rasalula were urging the emperor to do no such thing, and it was their advice that won out. Rasmukonen summoned one of the 10 officers, Lieutenant Partini, and told him, as quoted by Prouty, "The emperor has a right to do with you whatever he wishes, as your government has broken its word by not sending Major Salsa. Your death had been decided, but our emperor is kind and good, and does not wish to take revenge on the innocent for the treachery of others. Therefore, he grants you your freedom. You must leave, and at once. Tell Baratieri that if he does not send Salsa, he may send Felter. If he doesn't, then Christian blood will flow." The 10 Italians, still fearful that they might be butchered, left the camp with loud insults being flung at them from all directions by furious Ethiopians on February 3, 1896. When they approached the Italian lines, however, their compatriots thought they were an Ethiopian contingent and fired on them. They tried to raise the huge Italian flag that Partini had saved from Inda Jesus, but did not have a pole large enough to raise it. It was with a great deal of shouting that they were able to identify themselves as Italian and rejoined their compatriots. One day later, Balambaras Amanuid arrived at the Italian camp under a white flag and informed Baratieri that the emperor was waiting for the Italian representative, and only then did Baratieri finally send Major Salsa. Salsa arrived on February 11 with the ridiculous demands that Italy's terms were the renewal of the Treaty of Guzai according to its Italian version, and the return of all the territory that Ethiopia had seized from Italy, meaning all of Tigray. Menelik responded coldly that he hadn't come all this way to tear down the Italian flag in his country, only to raise it again. Empress Aitu, when told of these preposterous terms, is said to have said, "This man did not come to discuss anything but to spy." Upon being informed that the emperor had rejected his terms, Baratieri sent a message to Menelik saying, "Negotiations are broken off, and from this moment each army retakes its freedom of action." 2 days after Salsa presented these preposterous terms, on the night of February 13, the Italians were stunned to hear that Ras Subhat Aragawi and Dejazmach Hagos Tafari, both scions of the House of Sabagadis of Agami, had defected from the Italian side, taking 500 very well armed and trained soldiers and an invaluable knowledge of Italian fortifications, communications, networks, and supply lines with them. Both bowed before Menelik II and said they could no longer fight against their own people with strangers who had come from across the seas. It is not difficult to imagine that these two aristocrats had found it increasingly difficult to deal with the colonial delusion of superiority, and that this had reawakened their sense of patriotism. Their cooperation with Italy had always been fueled more by their personal hostility to Ras Mangasha Johannes rather than any sympathy towards Italy or hostility to their motherland. Almost immediately, they struck cutting blows to the Italians. Their forces attacked a column of Italian forces marching from Adigrat to Indijo, killing a large number of them. They cut the telegraph lines and stopped the food caravans bringing food to the Italian troops at Adigrat. The news that their nobles had returned to their allegiance to the Ethiopian crown also affected the treatment by the local population in Agami towards the Italian occupiers. Italian officers wrote home saying that the continuous attacks by Ras Subhat and Dejazmach Hagos had made repairing the telegraph line costly in both lives and ammunition. The local population was constantly cutting the communication lines, with even local women being spotted shooting at those trying to repair the telegraph. On February 23rd, the last of Menelik's vast army had arrived at Adwa. The emperor sat at the head of an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers, of which between 80 and 90,000 were armed with rifles and the rest with spears and swords. His senior commanders included Nugus Takla Haymanot, king of Gojam, Ras Makonnin Welde Mekele of Harar, Ras Mangasha Johannes of Tigray, Ras Wali of Yejju, Ras Mekele Ali of Wallo, Ras Alula Ngida Abba Negga, Ras Subhat Aragawi of Agami, Ras Welde Mekele Solomon of Hamasin, Ras Bitwadded Mangasha Atikam, Dejazmach Balcha Safu Abba Nafso, Dejazmach Damiso Nasibu, Dejazmach Hagos Tafari, Fitaurari Gabayo Gurmu Abba Gorao, Fitaurari Hapta Georgis Abba Mela, Lik Amekwas leader Ras Abata Bayado, and many other famous figures. They represented a wide cross-section of Ethiopians across ethnic, regional, and class lines. It was a historic moment of unity and patriotism, something the Italians had failed to predict or properly evaluate. The Ethiopian commanders were sending out bands of soldiers to forage for provisions as well as to scout the terrain. But thanks to cleverly planted counterintelligence, the Italians were tricked into believing that these represented a large number of deserters. The Italians were concerned as their food supplies were dangerously low and they would run out in less than a week. At the same time, they knew that the huge Ethiopian forces were living off the land and depleting the surrounding countryside. The longer they stayed put, the harder it would be to find provisions, and the more difficult it would be to keep the cohesion of the army and the goodwill of the local people. On the evening of February 28, 1896, General Oreste Baratieri summoned his leading commanders to discuss what their strategy going forward should be. The senior military staff members that participated in this war council were Generals Giuseppe Arimondi, Vittorio da Bornbida, Matteo Albertoni, Giuseppe Elena, and Colonel Valenzano. Baratieri was under immense pressure, not only by his dwindling provisions, but by the growing dissatisfaction of the Italian government with his performance following the defeats at Amba Alage and Mekele. Indeed, Baratieri had received a telegram from Prime Minister Crispi dated February 25th, in which the premier had acidly stated, "This one is a military tuberculosis, not a war." To Crispi and the government, the recent defeats threatened the prestige of Italy's monarchy and the honor of its military and the stability of his government. It is uncertain if Baratieri had learned that he had in fact already been replaced as governor and commander, and that his replacement, Lieutenant General Antonio Baldissera, was already on his way to Missoula, traveling under a pseudonym. If Baratieri did in fact know that he was being replaced, he may have acted out of a desire to achieve some great victory while still in his position to achieve a level of vindication. Baratieri also endured the contempt of his subordinate generals, especially Arimondi, with whom relations were particularly cold. During the meeting with his generals, Baratieri noted that they had less than 5 days of provisions left. He asked their opinions about whether they should abandon their positions and retreat to Asmara, or if they should launch an immediate attack. He mentioned the planted false intelligence about widespread desertions on the Ethiopian side and other false pieces of information that a large number of Ethiopian troops had gone to Aksum on pilgrimage. His subordinates all fiercely opposed any thought of a retreat. They argued that a retreat at this point would be disastrous on the already failing troop morale. General Dabormida even exclaimed, Italy would prefer the loss of 2,000 to 3,000 men to the dishonor of a retreat. Baratieri told his generals that he was waiting for one more piece of intelligence before deciding their course of action, and retired for the night. Unknown to the Italian senior staff, Menelik and his camp had just received exhilarating news from Ausa that Ras Wolde Giorgis Abuye and Azaj Wolde Zadik had smashed the forces of Sultan Muhammad Humphrey and ended any possibility of his joining the Italian effort. The Italians did not have to wait long for Baratieri's decision. As 1896 was a leap year, the next day was February 29, and Baratieri issued orders effective at 9 p.m. that evening for his almost 18,000 troops to march out under cover of darkness and attack the forces of the Emperor of Ethiopia, encamped at Adwa. The 4 battalions marched forth into the moonless night. According to David Levering Lewis in his book The Race for Fashoda, the plan called for General Dabormida leading the 2nd Infantry Brigade to lead the right column, General Arimondi leading the 1st Infantry Brigade to lead the central column, and General Albertoni leading the Native Brigade on the left. General Elena's 3rd Infantry Brigade were to form the rear guard following behind Albertoni's Native Brigade and forming the reserves ready to come to the relief of the others if things went badly. General Baratieri and his men were with General Elena. As its name suggests, Albertoni's Native Brigade was made up entirely of Askari troops recruited from populations of Eritrea and Sudan, while the other 3 brigades were a mix of both native and Italian soldiers. These included elite Bersaglieri and Alpini units, but a good portion were inexperienced conscripts drafted from various regiments in Italy. Albertoni's Native Brigade was supposed to set the pace for the other columns. Lewis states that the supporting crossfire each column could give the others made the soldiers as deadly as razored shears. Albertoni was to position himself on a mountain known as Kidana Meret, which would give the Italian forces the high ground to face the Ethiopians. The Italian columns marched through the night, intending on surprising and devastating the Ethiopian forces in the morning. In the wee hours of Sunday, March 1st, 1896, Emperor Menelik II and his wife Empress Taitu, his daughter Zauditu, and many of his leading commanders and nobles were praying in one of Adwa's churches at a service being led by the Coptic Archbishop of Ethiopia, Abuna Matthios. During the service, a courier from among Ras Alula's men dashed into the church, bowed low before the emperor, and told him the Italians had been detected marching en masse towards Adwa. Soon, more messengers arrived with the same message. The Archbishop paused the services and announced that he would permit those attending to interrupt the service and rush to the front, and then raise his cross to grant absolution from their sins as they went forth to face death. Only the Emperor, the Empress, and the royal ladies remained to the end of the liturgy as the rest of the congregation rushed out to do battle. It happened to be St. George's Day, commemorating one of Ethiopia's patron saints. Nugus Takla Haymanot was sent out in command of the right wing. Ras Alula was put in charge of the left wing. Ras Makonnen and Ras Mangesha Yohannes commanded the center, together with the Wallo cavalry of Ras Mekele. The Emperor and Empress made up the reserve in the rear, with the Empress cannoneers and the Mahal Safari troops of Shoa surrounding them on Mount Abba Garima. The Italians almost immediately ran into serious trouble. The terrain was very difficult, there was a constant drizzle, and the ground was muddy and slippery. The maps that they were using were very faulty, and to top it off, they were unaware that several of the Eritrean and Tigrayan guides leading them to their desired positions were actually in the service of the Emperor of Ethiopia and were deliberately leading them astray. Instead of the three columns moving parallel to each other, they had become disoriented, and in the darkness, one battalion became confused and crossed another, and it took them an hour to extricate themselves from the resulting confusion. Then, the three lead battalions became separated and marched away from each other. Their plan had been to reach their desired positions by dawn. When Albertoni reached the position he thought was Mount Kidana, he realized he was in the wrong location, a dangerous distance from his compatriots. He tried to correct his position, marching towards the actual Kidana, not realizing that the Ethiopians had already set up their mountain artillery there. Indeed, the Ethiopians had positioned themselves on the hills overlooking Adwa and its surrounding valleys. In his scramble to reposition his troops on the real Kidana, Albertoni marched his soldiers directly into the path of Ras Alula's charging army at exactly 6:10 a.m. Albertoni's heavily outnumbered Askaris tried to fight off the onslaught of Ethiopian forces for 2 hours, but General Albertoni was captured, and the remnants of his battalion were pushed back, taking refuge among General Arimondi's forces. Arimondi's battalion, with the remnants of Albertoni's battalion, beat back wave after wave of Ethiopian soldiers who assaulted the Italian position, but then Menelik released the 25,000-man Shoan Mahal Safari troops he had held in reserve, and they overwhelmed Arimondi's position. 2 companies of elite Bersaglieri troops who arrived at that exact moment proved useless and were slaughtered. General Dabormida, hearing of the initial assault on Albertoni's battalion, had moved in to try and support him, but had failed to reach him in time. He found himself cut off from the bulk of the Italian army and began a desperate retreat towards friendly positions in the rear. Instead, he disastrously marched his battalion into a narrow valley where the Wallo cavalry under Ras Mekele charged them and annihilated them while chanting Ibalgumi, Ibalgumi, which means reap, reap. The remaining Italian troops under General Baratieri and General Elena were quickly outflanked and destroyed on the slopes of Mount Bela by the troops of the King of Gojam, Nugus Takla Haymanot. By noon, it became clear that all was lost for the Italian side, and Baratieri began to prepare to flee. The gunfire, however, continued through the afternoon into the evening. The retreat turned into full-fledged flight. As the Italians fled towards Eritrea in disorder, they left behind all their artillery and 11,000 rifles and virtually all of their transport. 7,000 Italians lay dead on the field of battle and along the routes they took on their flight north. 1,500 were wounded and 3,000 were taken prisoner. Ethiopian casualties have been estimated to be between 4,000 and 5,000 dead and 8,000 wounded. However, as noted by Paul B. Hens, Baratieri's army, which just that morning had been the largest European army assembled in Africa until that time, had completely disintegrated, while Menelik's army was intact and in possession of a huge amount of the Italian army's weapons. General Arimondi and General Dabormida were both killed in battle, and General Dabormida's remains would never be found. General Matteo Albertoni was captured. A torrential rainstorm ended the day, and Menelik commanded his soldiers not to kill those who surrendered. The women, who had been organized to carry water to the Ethiopian fighters, now began to help in taking prisoners. Empress Aitu returned to the royal camp first. She entered the audience canopy, and after bowing low before the thrones, she took her seat and wept for the war dead as the names of the prominent ones were read to her. Among the dead Ethiopian notables was Fitaurari Gabeyo of Amba Alage fame, of whom both Menelik and Aitu were very fond. Menelik returned from Mount Abba Garima that night and took his seat at the side of his weeping wife. He ordered the delirious celebrations cut short, saying they were inappropriate on a day when Christians had slaughtered each other. He also ordered the red umbrellas held over the members of the imperial family taken down and replaced by black ones. Yet Menelik II, his nobles and officers, and the valiant people of Ethiopia from every class, ethnicity, and region had united to achieve something monumental on March 1st, 1896. An African army had crushed a European one on the field of battle. This would send shockwaves across both continents and have great consequences. In our next episode, we will discuss the aftermath of the Battle of Adwa and its repercussions in Ethiopia, Italy, and the rest of Africa and Europe, and the world. Until then, please check out our website for additional information at www.tarikamba.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, look for audio versions of us on Spotify, Anchor, and other podcast channels, and on social media. Send us your questions and comments via solomon@tarikamba.com or our social media